So I'm new to Tip Talks, so the first thing I wanted to do is just thank the Political Science Department for inviting me to do this, and apologize to students who are currently in my film 390 because they have heard me talk about this extensively already, but I hope something will get added. I also wanted to acknowledge the little joke, if you're a cinephile and you get it, or how I stopped worrying and learned to love hegemony, or how I stopped worrying and learned to love the bomb, if you have seen Dr. Strangelove. Okay, so the first thing I want to establish is how I'm understanding the concept of ideology. So I'm understanding it in a sort of neo-Marxist sense, following Louis Althusser, as meaning the imaginary relations to real relations. Cinema, since the sort of mid part of the century, has been understood to be inherently ideological. This is largely because cinema operates, or the behind-the-scenes elements of cinema operate unbeknownst to us, but they present us with a vision of the world that presents itself as inherently realistic. So one of the biggest draws of cinema is that it looks so much like our real life. It feels so much like our real life. And yet, we're supposed to ignore the structuring dynamics of power that give us a certain vision of reality. So there's that aspect to it. There's also the aspect that this is a commercial product. Film is both art and commerce. So it is sort of straddling the line between individual artistic practice and collective commercial mass media product, which essentially forces it to be obligated to those very dynamics of power. It has to make money for its shareholders. Otherwise, it will not. A studio will not continue to exist and continue to be able to make films. So there are power dynamics that are in play because of the relationship to reality and because of the fact that this is commerce. This is economics. This is profitability. In particular for today, there's a lot of things I sort of teased out about what I might talk about in terms of ideology. I'm going to go to my comfort zone, which is discussions of gender and discussions of race as they are represented in Hollywood cinema. So I'm going to draw extensively on a couple of studies done by UCLA and by USC regarding the diversity in Hollywood. So the first, the UCLA Diversity Report, as you can see up here, conducted in 2018, examines films from 2011 until 2016 regarding a number of factors. Among them is the cast's diversity. So as you can see, top line here sort of represents the gray line, the cast that is male or male identifying. The yellow line or orange line is female or female identifying. So I think you should notice, first and foremost, the predominance of men on screen as opposed to women on screen. Where this becomes particularly fascinating for me is films that outwardly seem to be celebrating things like powerful women, like racial diversity, but whose behind-the-scenes operation or power structures or implicit biases do not actually do what they purport to do. So for instance, I know you were all thinking it, obviously. You were thinking about Disney princesses. So there's been some examination recently about Disney princesses by a pair of linguists who were looking at 12 films spanning all the way back to 1937 to examine how much speaking women do in these films. What percentage of the dialogue is spoken by women as opposed to spoken by men? And examining Disney princesses, long the sort of adoration of young girls in the United States, seemed an apt place for them to do it. You might think, obviously, we have come so far since 1937, so women in Disney films must speak much more than they did in 1937. So they found initially, as you can see, that women speak 50 to 70% in some of the older 3 films. What you might be more surprised about, and it should be noted, that it does not include lines that are sung. It is spoken dialogue only. But you might be more surprised by these numbers. You might think a film about The Little Mermaid would feature The Little Mermaid speaking extensively. One that involves both a female protagonist and a female antagonist. No, they do not speak the majority of lines. You might think that a film, for instance, like Frozen, that has been touted since it came out as a moment of female empowerment, would involve more women speaking. 41% of spoken dialogue, with a film about 2 sisters as its central characters. So in other words, we still have men delivering the vast majority of spoken dialogue, even in contemporary Disney films. I don't want to leave you completely remiss in thinking it's all terrible. There are a few films that have done well. Chief among them is Brave. 74% of spoken dialogue from female characters. So I suppose there is hope. I don't want to leave you completely believing that the system has failed us. But we should be kind of paying attention to why women are not speaking. And even if we take into account the fact that they might be singing, is there a difference between spoken dialogue and singing dialogue in terms of doing things like pushing the narrative forward? Does one thing allow for narrative agency and the other thing perhaps not, because it's mired only in something like spectacle? Similarly, or perhaps even worse, is the problem of directorship. So as you can see here, only about 1 in 10 female directors, or 1 in 10 directors are female, operating in Hollywood in the United States between the years of 2011 and 2016. So again, who is structuring the vision, the on-screen representation? It's men. Who is writing the stories, which are then getting filmed by men? Hint, it's also men. So again, right, we get this like prevailing domination of stories that are about men or about women being told by men, are about men being told by men, about women being told by men still. So there's a problem here with the ideology of a film that purports even potentially to be female-friendly, about a group of female friends, very forward-thinking in its representation of gender, will still largely be structured by a male screenwriter and a male director. The USC report that came out in 2016, it looked at the films of 2014, all of the films released in Hollywood by major studios in 2014. And one of the things that it noticed, I think would probably come as little to no surprise to you. I'm going to move. I can see people sort of craning their heads around me. Should probably come as little to no surprise to you is the degree of elements like sexy clothing, sexualization or attractiveness, nudity, that these are characteristics associated far more with the feminine in Hollywood cinema than with the masculine. So I think, to some degree, this is no surprise. To another degree, I think the disparity between these two categories of male versus female should really be noteworthy to us. I wanted to give you a couple of my favorite Tumblr images from, and you should look at this, it's a Tumblr called Heroines in Heels that points out the kind of internal biases that are focused specifically on female characters who are supposed to be sort of action heroes. For instance, and in case, you can read the caption. This is Mila Jovovich in Ultraviolet. The joke is she can change absolutely everything about herself, from hair color to her size. She can manipulate everything, but apparently she can't find an outfit that is more suitable for the physical activity that she's supposed to be doing. So she still has to wear over-the-knee boots with a high heel, is the best costume for that. If you've seen this film, this might be among your favorite examples. Why in the world, when fighting a genetically modified dinosaur, are you in high heels in the jungle? And in fact, it makes a good deal of joke about the fact that this female character persists in wearing her business attire and her high heels in the jungle. The male character is constantly kind of pointing that out to her. But nonetheless, she persists, and not in the good way. Last but not least, I know this is a TV show, but I love the caption. Chuck's agent Sarah Walker, totally practical. That this is exactly what female FBI agents, or I'm not exactly certain, federal agents of some kind, wear when they are out investigating. Slinky black dress with a hip holster and high heels. So that this extends to not just the dialogue, but to the representation, the costuming, the nature of the depiction of femininity on screen. If you saw these in 2017, you might recall again how sort of celebrated Wonder Woman was, right? Female superhero, out there kicking butt, wonderful kind of Amazonian backstory. There is a certain degree of controversy that came with this. In 2017, we get the original Wonder Woman, not the original, but we get Wonder Woman, the Patty Jenkins version. Later that year, we get Justice League, directed by Zack Snyder. What you get when moving from one film to another is a different representation of the Amazonian female warriors. Left side, female-directed, female costume-designed Amazonian warrior. Right side, male-directed, male costume-designed Amazonian warrior. I've never been an Amazonian warrior, but I assume that one of those things is more conducive to battling than the other thing. I assume a midsection might be a thing you'd want covered when fighting with someone. But the practicality, right, of that gets lost because the emphasis is on overly sexualizing a strong female figure, because she has to be somewhat sexualized in order apparently to be acceptable within this universe. Again, same characters, same cinematic and comic book universe, radically different conceptualizations depending on what's happening behind the camera and in the production. Similar sort of problems here exist with respect to race. So as you'll see, the middle line here that's sort of useful to us is understanding the US population, or the percentage of the US population that are persons of color, versus their representation on screen is the blue line, and the representation on screen, or the dominance in the cast of white characters, is that top line. Again, perhaps this comes as no surprise, but I want you to pay attention again to the constancy between 5 years, that there's this lack of change or celebration or increase of diversity across a 5-year span in Hollywood, that things are remaining relatively constant because we have not kind of undone any power structure that continues to make this occur. Within that, I do think it's important to acknowledge the percentage not just of white characters versus non-white characters, but within the non-white characters, the kind of breakdown of who gets represented on screen. Because for Hollywood, when it does address questions of race, it is usually questions of whiteness and blackness. It is rarely questions of other ethnic identities. It rarely delves into the question of Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, as you can see, are a teeny tiny percentage of that pie, right? So Hollywood thinks, forgive the pun, but very much in terms of the black and white, right? Similarly, we have very similar problems to what we saw in terms of who's structuring behind the scenes for the director. Again, 1.3 out of 10 directors are persons of color. And if you combine those together with the small number of women who direct, I think you would be hard-pressed to find many examples of women of color who are given the power of directing. So again, what we're seeing here is the way in which the business practices sort of are mired in reasserting the status quo of power dynamics. Not intentionally, it's not like anybody's being nefarious or targeting or intentionally racist, but because film is ideological, it can do nothing more or less than reproduce the ideology from which it emerges. I wanted to share this quote because I found it, and I'm going to disrupt this film extensively, but this is a description or someone's review of Green Book, which if you've seen the film, this is the Best Picture winner of the last Academy Awards. The entire kind of review here, and this is just a Google user, not a professional reviewer, but nonetheless, I think the grammar might give that away. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting, and I've bolded a few things for you that I think are incredibly important, is the idea of overcoming diversity as a personal issue, right? Overcoming diversity as just an overcoming of idiosyncrasies, right? This is a classic kind of odd couple story, except instead of the messy person and the tidy person, it is the person of color and the white person, as if these are just simple idiosyncratic elements of our personalities that you can just overcome in order to realize deep down you're just the same, which would be a wonderful story, and Hollywood wants it to be a wonderful story, if not for the fact that, again, it's reproducing a certain ideological hierarchy. So here are the persons behind this film. The persons behind a film that is all about overcoming racial diversity and finding out that we are all one. On the left is the director and one of the writers. Middle and right side are the other two writers. The middle, Nick Villalonga, is also the son of the protagonist of the film. So unsurprisingly, this film tells the story largely from that protagonist's perspective and frames the entire question of racial diversity in terms of his perspective, much more so than Mahershala Ali's character. So the focus is on the lessons learned by the white character because, again, white director, white producers, white screenwriters, there's this question about being able to think outside of that dominant understanding of identity as inherently white, inherently masculine, in order to tell a different kind of story. Because we've got almost all white male directors, white male producers, white male writers. Ooh, wow, it looks even worse on this screen. That's great. So I wanted to point out another thing, and forgive me again, students in my 390, you've heard this already. But with respect to Green Book, I found a really wonderful example of arguments being made about, again, this not being a question of targeting racism. It's not as if the writer of the film set out to say, I'm going to tell the story of a white man, right, who learned from a black male character how to become a better version of himself. That's not the goal here, but that's the understanding inherent in a kind of ideological system that prioritizes whiteness over otherness. And that goes down even to something that seems as objective as lighting. So when standards for lighting were developed, white was understood to be the standard person you were lighting. So you were lighting almost all white stars and starlets. That has continued to this day. It's a problem that the 80s buddy comedy has never been able to overcome either. The 80s interracial buddy comedy that has a white male lead and a black male lead and does not know how to light them. So who does it privilege? I think you can tell from the image. It privileges the white male character. And you can tell me all you want to that Mahershala Ali is in the back of the car and there's less light in the back of the car. But this is where I return to my first point. This is not about realism. This is about a structuring of a version of the world that is not inherently realistic, but is a system of decisions that someone is making. Again, not necessarily to target blackness, but in order to create a version of what they see as the world. Not what the world actually looks like, because the world, as we just saw, is far more racially diverse than what we actually get on screen. So the choice to have Mahershala Ali's character in the back, right, and the choice to prioritize making sure Viggo Mortensen looks good means Mahershala Ali disappears almost entirely, right? There's not an emphasis on his individual characteristics. He is largely out of focus. The best we see from him are his teeth. Right? That is perhaps the most noticeable function of him here. Maybe his shirt also, again, because they're both white. So the way that lighting is sort of emphasizing whiteness over darkness here. And a great deal of sort of scholars have pointed out that this film falls into the trope of the magical Negro because of the perspective of the film being so linked to whiteness that blackness comes to only serve an educational purpose for the white male character. He learns something. He betters himself. It's not about anything other than what blackness can bring to whiteness, not what they can actually, if you return to that review, they can overcome together. That's not actually what's happening here, right? It can't be what's happening because it's framed entirely in terms of the question of whiteness. Because I'm almost out of time, and because I wanted to include so much more in this presentation, because there's so much more to ideology, but I want to point out that this impacts more than just questions of race, questions of gender. There's questions of sexuality, especially well-meaning films that really want to represent a spectrum of sexuality fall into similar tropes about the expectation of normalcy being heteronormative. It infects the way that films, even films, if you love Mad Max, it's fantastic that you love Mad Max, but for a film like Mad Max Fury Road that is so invested in telling a story about about tyrannical control of a resource like water, it is a film that went to the Namibian desert and did irreparable damage to an actual ecosystem. So what I want you to be thinking about is what we see is before the camera and the production histories behind the camera don't often align with one another, because that's how ideology sort of functions, right? It's this invisible structuring system that you're not supposed to pay attention to. As a final note, what can you do? Intentionally go out and seek films that support not just on-screen representation of underrepresented groups, but technicians, cinematographers of color. We saw, for instance, with Black Panther, not just a representation on-screen of blackness, but a real commitment to diversity off-screen, with females black females in particular, doing things like costume design and getting nominated and winning for costume design and production design. This is important to pay attention not just to what you see on screen, but what you see off. It's equally important. Thank you.